right, epic morning ride out here, Mount Tamarancho. I'm now at the Marin Bike Museum. We're gonna go take a look at some of the first bikes ever built in mountain biking. I hear that they have the second mountain bike ever built. Here are the guys right here. We're getting in to get into the museum. It's a $10 admission. It helps go towards all this cool stuff. You just pay right up here.
Yep. There you go.
There it goes. All right, let's go take a look at all the cool bikes that are in here. Oh, hey, what's up, you guys? I have a special treat for you all. I am at the Marin Museum of Bicycling in Marin County. I'm in actually Fairfax, I think, and I have Kilpatrick here. He's gonna take us through a bit of the history on kind of where the bikes started, where they've gone, and we're gonna do a little bit of a deeper dive when we get to the mountain biking side. So, Kilpatrick, take it away.
All right, well, I'll try to talk fast because there's a lot to pack in here, especially with the 19th century, so we can have time to fit in the mountain bike part of the story. I'll start right here where it all started in the 19th century, in the 1860s in Paris, France, where the first pedal bicycles were produced. Now, they weren't the first bicycles ever. The first ones had no pedals at all and often looked like what we see above the door there. A hobby horse, it was often called, but it was originally called a Dreisine, or a Laufmaschine, after its inventor, Karl von Drais, a German inventor who in 1817 came up with a way to get about at a time when horses were in short supply, and he called it a Laufmaschine, which means running machine, and that's what you did. You just kind of pushed with your feet, a lot like these little Strider bikes that kids start out on today. And so that was all the rage for a handful of years until maybe people got tired of pushing with their feet and wearing out their shoes. And so it was 40 years later when a Frenchman had the bright idea of putting pedals on one of these machines. And his name was Pierre Lallemant. He can be seen right up there on a cycle that looks extremely like the one here in our museum, the closest match we've ever found. And this was called the Velocipede in France when they started making them. The Michaud family of blacksmiths were the first to start pounding these out, and they were 75 pounds worth of wood and wrought iron. Believe it or not, that's how much this one weighs, and yet it was a lot of fun, and it was absolutely thrilling. And at that point, it took off, and it spread around the world. Even in China in 1869, you could buy one of these. Just a few years after they started building them. This one comes from 1868, which is the first year of mass production when the Michaud family got some funding and incorporated as a company to start making more and more of these. And so they feature pedaling right directly to that front axle, which means you're pedaling on the steering wheel, and that wheel is essentially a scaled-down wagon wheel. Wooden spokes, compression spokes, and an iron tire that holds it all together. It would fall apart without that iron hoop holding it in compression. And you have an auxiliary brake here where you spin the handlebars and spool up that rawhide cord and pull that wooden lever, or that wooden brake pad, against the iron tire, and apparently it slows you down a little bit. Mostly you'd resist the forward motion of the pedals, like any fixed gear bike, to slow down. But if you couldn't even keep your feet on those pedals because you're going down a hill and they're going around too fast, you park your legs up here. Maybe you can see this guy doing in this indoor riding academy in Paris from this very same year, 1868. And look, they're already doing tricks, showing off for the ladies. And the ladies themselves are getting into it. And in Bordeaux, France, you can see them racing. And that would not have happened in Victorian England, just across the channel. That would have been scandalous to show that much leg, or even to sit astride something, right? Like ladies were riding side saddle to preserve their modesty.
Wow.
And but the French are different, then and now. And here we have three guys in San Francisco, downtown on Geary and Stockton in 1868, also from this very same year. So they were already spreading around the world, and they were all the rage. But in 1870, France went to war with Prussia and had other things to build, and other things to do with their time there for a while. It was a short-lived war, but it was enough for the British to take the lead in this new bicycle industry, and specifically in Coventry, England. And that's where the wheel grew and grew some more until it reached the limit, which was your inseam. And the whole reason we have this kind of evolutionary dead end of a bicycle and why it got to this proportion was because there was no practical chain yet developed. And if you wanted to go farther with each revolution of the pedals, you needed a larger wheel with a larger circumference to take you farther with each revolution. And so the wheel grew until till it was right up at your inseam, and that's why the saddle is mounted that closely to the tire so that you could get the biggest wheel under you possible, so that you could be the fastest guy out, in your cycling club, like these guys, or the fastest guy out there on the racetrack. And it's not just the form factor of this bicycle that's so very different, though. It's all the materials. We've got tubular steel now instead of solid iron that came before, and those velocipedes, which is what the French called these, meaning fast foot. They called these ordinary bicycles in their day because they had become the ordinary bicycle, and that was to differentiate it from what came before. Later on, you may have heard the term penny farthing. These high wheelers were often called later on as they were kind of going extinct. It was kind of a pejorative term, because once we got bicycles that are more like what we're riding today, it was these became obsolete and kind of worthless. And so it was saying, oh, you still on that old penny farthing, was like saying, oh, your bike's not worth much more than a penny and a farthing anymore. Wow. A farthing is a quarter of a cent, a quarter of a penny. But it was also a reference to the big wheel and the small wheel. Here you see the English penny, which was huge up until the early 1960s, and the farthing, a much smaller coin. So it was a reference to the little wheel and the big wheel. But as I said, the materials are all different. We've got tubular steel instead of solid iron. We've got rubber for tires instead of iron tires. Now they are solid rubber, but that's a big improvement over solid iron. And that's thanks to Charles Goodyear figuring out how to make rubber useful as a tire, because it had been used for centuries, but was no good for a tire because it would become soft and squishy on a hot day and become brittle and crack on a cold day, until Goodyear figured out how to add sulfur actually to the matrix and create that vulcanization process that made rubber usable across a 100-degree plus temperature range. We've got wire tension spokes, a very big deal. So now you've essentially got suspension because these wire tension spokes are compliant, and give you a little bit of give and a smoother ride, but they're also exactly like the spokes we're using today, with the J-bend at the hub and the threaded nipple at the rim, the crossing at the spokes. These were all separate patents. So it took 20 years before these became the typical spoke, because none of the other makers wanted to pay the royalties to the patent holders to use this kind of spoke, or few of them did. And so the next several bikes used different kinds of spokes until 20 years later the patent runs out and everybody's free to use these without paying royalties. But part of the big deal here is the adjustable ball bearing hub. Set the Wayback Machine to 1971, when there was a sudden bike boom in America, the second one since the 1890s. But in that interim period, it was really only children that bikes were being marketed to in America. After 1905 or so, adults had largely lost interest, and it became just kind of a child's toy. Until 1971, out of nowhere, American adults started buying bicycles in huge numbers.
Do we know
once
why?
again. There's multiple reasons why. There's no single reason, one of which is the fact that this whole health craze was starting out, people running, getting outside, jogging, just more outdoor activities in general, like camping, and maybe it was a reaction to the space race. Oh, we're moving too fast, let's go back to simpler things. I don't know, there's a lot of things, but it wasn't the oil crisis, because that happened in 1973, and the sales had already started to rise in 1971. And in that year, or the next year, 1972, a bunch of the guys here in Marin, the young guys, were riding around on these fast, skinny-tired bikes, these road bikes that we didn't call road bikes back then because we didn't need to. They were just 10 speeds. And one of those guys was our curator, Joe Breeze, who joined this bicycle club in Marin County called Velo Club Tamalpais, which was started in 1972. And he was a young road racer. And in 1973, he started building road racing frames himself, like this blue one you see here. And he learned the craft from Albert Eisentraut, who had started classes in Berkeley in 1973. And around that same time, Joe and his buddy Mark Vendetti, another fellow racer, were interested in these 19th century bikes. In fact, that's when Joe first saw this collection in the man's house, just filling his spare bedrooms and such. And it was only 40 years later or more that he had the opportunity to include those bikes in this museum. But back in 1973, he and Mark were sent down to this old shop in Santa Cruz where people told him they have old bikes down there. Maybe they have those 19th century bikes you're looking for. So they made a road trip and didn't find any bikes this old. So Mark said, hey, just so we don't go home empty-handed, Joe, why don't you offer him $5 for one of those little cruisers in the corner over there? And Joe said, why would I want one of those, Mark? Like, these were proper bikes to Joe at the time, you know, like Italian-made or French-made, you know, skinny tire racing bikes. But Mark told Joe how, you know, I used to ride these around the trails around Mount Tam and Larkspur with those big fat balloon tires. They're a blast out there in the dirt, and I still have mine. You should get one. You'll see how much fun you can have. So Joe offered him $5 and talked him down from $7. And this is the actual bike. You know, only when he got it was all covered in red paint by some kid who painted even the tires, and it had a basket and a chain guard. And when it originally was purchased in the 1940s, it would have looked like this, with the fenders and rack and chain guard and the fake gas tank to appeal to children and make them feel like they're riding motorcycles. So Joe stripped all that stuff off and just scraped off all that red latex paint and threw that bicycle in the back of somebody's pickup truck and got a ride to the top of Mount Tam. And he rode down the old scenic railway grade, what was left of the 19th century railway, the scenic railway up there, the crookedest railroad in the world, that ran from Mill Valley up to the top of the mountain and then down into Muir Woods. So he bombed down that hill, back down into Mill Valley where he lived, with a grin from ear to ear. And he hasn't been the same since, you know, because it changed his life. He had a new appreciation for this whole new kind of bicycling, and so he was so thrilled with it. He rode that bicycle to the next race club meeting, the Velo Club Tamalpais. Here's some of the group. They were about 3 times larger than what you see in this photo here, but there's Joe Breeze in the center, and here's Gary Fisher next to him. You might have heard of him, and Charlie Kelly down here. And Joe says at the next meeting, 1 month later, Gary Fisher and Charlie Kelly showed up on similar old clunkers, because that's what they called these old bikes, because they were just old beater bikes, clunkers that you could find for free in the city dump or find for $5 at a garage sale, because they were the leftover bikes from an earlier era, from the 1940s and 50s, and they were fairly plentiful and cheap. So all the guys started getting these bikes, and it just morphed into their wintertime fun. They'd race in the summer and then just goof off in the hills, you know, in the winter, and have a blast on these bikes that they didn't have to worry about because they weren't expensive. And pretty soon, though, because they're all competitive types, somebody said, I'm faster down the mountain than you are. So they had to have a race to prove who's fastest, right? And so one of the guys, Fred Wolf, you can see pictured in this photograph, he found a good fire road about 3 miles west of the museum here, and that was good for a time trial to take place, where they could bomb down the hill and finally see who's the fastest. So they went out there in October of 1976 to settle it once and for all. And so they had a race, and but then a lot of the guys said, hey, wait a minute, I wasn't there, and I think I'm faster than all you guys. So they have to have another race, right? So the second race happened on October 26th, a Tuesday. So clearly these guys didn't have day jobs. And fortunately, all the rest were recorded, because Charlie Kelly, who ran the race and was the race official at the top, you know, holding your wheel and sending you off at 2-minute intervals, the riders would go down. This race down this fire road, Cascade Fire Road, was, at least the part of the course they were riding on, was about 2 miles long, a little bit more, and it would drop 1,300 feet in that time. So that you were on the brake a lot, and all you had was this single-speed coaster brake, which you can see a cutaway version of here, where you pedal backwards, and these brass brake shoes are forced outwards to press against the shell of the hub when you pedal backwards, and that's what creates the friction that slows you down and eventually locks up the brake. Then that's the only brake you had, and so while you're going down this very steep hill, if you dared to look behind you halfway down, you might see smoke coming out of the back of your bicycle because the grease inside was getting so hot from the friction that by the time you got to the bottom of the hill, it was practically glowing red, and all the grease inside was just vaporized. And so you would have to come back go home after every race and repack your hub with grease. And so all the racers were repackers at the end of the day, and so it just got this natural name of the Repack race. And the Repack race is the very crucible in which the mountain bike was formed, because there would be 24 of these races over the next 3 years, and this is what improved the breed. This is what caused them to modify these bicycles and make them better for competition. And so they did just that, and they started applying, because they were road racers and they knew what quality parts were, they started putting those parts on these bicycles to make them better and faster and maybe stop better. This one has bolt-on cantilever brakes that you could find still in some old shops that were original Schwinn parts, accessory parts. And then they found a way to get derailleurs on them. This bicycle you see above you was probably the very first of the clunkers to have derailleurs put on there. And you notice it has a front and rear derailleur. And what was the key to making that work was that drum brake hub made by Union out of Germany, which allowed you to have a freewheel, 5-speed freewheel on there, as well as an internal brake, because the caliper brakes were practically useless. So the drum brakes did a much better job of slowing you down. And so this bike has 3 brake levers, because it has 3. Okay, so the next major development in the development of the mountain bicycle is what Joe did with this bike. He took it down to Tom Ritchie in Palo Alto because he wanted Tom, who was another young racer who was building frames as a young man, he wanted Tom to build a tandem for Joe and his friend Otis Guy to ride across the country from San Francisco to New York and hopefully set a world record. They had tried earlier in 1976 on a frame that was too small for them, so they were going to Tom to make a custom frame, and there is the tandem that Tom built for them. Now, Tom had made 1,000 frames, they say, by the time he was 21 years old. He got started when he was 15 years old, and he was almost as fast as making frames as he was a racer. He was always either racing or building frames, and that's one of the reasons Joe and Otis went to him, is because they had a deadline and they wanted to get this frame done and on the road. And so Joe took this bike down to Tom because he wanted him to use the same construction technique with these twin lateral tubes, which you can see on Tom's tandem up there. Now, that was something that was not uncommon for tandems to have, but Tom did his differently when he used those skinny tubes in his design. And Joe just took this down to Tom to show him this little detail right there where he how he treated the intersection there of the tubes between the seat tube and the skinny tubes. And but Tom took one look at this bike when they pulled it out of the pickup truck and said, "Oh, what is that? Man, I think I need to build one of these, Joe." After your tandem, of course, and because Tom had been riding off-road on his road bikes, skinny tire bikes, in the dirt for several years at that point, and realized the usefulness of a bike like this right away. And so Joe told him, "Hey, if you're going to make one, you might give Gary Fisher a call, because he didn't get one of mine, and he was off in Europe racing at the time, and came home and all his friends had these new state-of-the-art mountain bikes, even though they weren't calling them mountain bikes yet. They were still clunkers, and Gary was still on his old clunker, and sure enough, he did want one that Tom was going to build. In fact, he got Tom Ritchie #2. This blue one is Tom Ritchie mountain bike #1. This is Tom's first one he built, and his prototype his personal bike that he used to work out his designs going forward. And sure enough, the second one did go to Gary Fisher. In fact, Tom built 3 up at once, and Gary said, hey, I can sell that third one for you up in Fairfax, and he did at Sunshine Bicycles down the street here, which is still here after all these years. 2 months later, Tom calls up Gary and says, hey, I've got 10 more of these frames and forks, you know, for off-road riding, and nobody down here on the peninsula knows what to do with them. Do you think maybe you could take them up to Marin and sell them to some of your crazy friends? And Gary said, heck yeah, and he went down and filled up his car with all those frame sets and got back up here to Fairfax, where he saw Charlie Kelly in front of the Fairfax Theater, and he said, hey, Charlie, come check this out. And he opens his trunk and says, look what Tom set me up with. You want to build them up and sell them with me? And Charlie said, heck yeah. And he said, you want to go into business together maybe? And he said, maybe. So they thought about it, and they talked to Tom. Tom agreed to be not in their business, not a part of their business, but to be a supplier, to supply them with frames going forward. So based on that, they launched their new company, went over to the Bank of America here in Fairfax, opened their checking account for this new company, and they said, what's it called? What name do we put on the account? And Charlie said, Mountain Bikes. And that's probably the first time anybody typed up those 2 words in Marin County or anywhere else, and because nobody was calling them mountain bikes. These guys have been doing this thing with these clunkers, bombing down the hills and going cross country on them, but they never called them mountain bikes. They called them clunkers or ballooners or cruisers, but never mountain bikes. And Charlie didn't come up with that term. He actually heard it from this touring rider who was coming through town, had stopped at Sunshine Bicycles, where Charlie was working on his original Breezer, adding some part to it, and the guy stopped and looked at Charlie's bike and said, hey, we ride fat tire bikes kind of like this down in the hills of Santa Barbara, and we call them mountain bikes. And that stuck in Charlie's head. That guy went on his way, and so it was many moons later that it kind of popped out of Charlie's head, and when they were launching this company. So this was the very first company devoted to this new kind of bicycle, and Mountain Bikes was the name of their company. In fact, it was Kelly Fisher Mountain Bikes, and they tried to trademark the term mountain bikes, and they hired a lawyer who drew up the paperwork, the application, and it went before a judge who ultimately rejected it. It was not accepted, and it wasn't because of anything wrong with the idea, the concept. It was just the lawyer they hired didn't know what he was doing and didn't present it properly. They thought he was trying to trademark a term for the kind of bicycle, when it was really, no, it's just the name of our company, that we're trying to trademark, said Charlie. So they weren't going to work with that guy anymore, and they didn't have the money to try again with a better lawyer, because they were just 2 hippies in a garage putting together bikes. They didn't have this kind of money at that time to try again. So they just thought, maybe nobody will find out. We'll just see what happens. And for a while there, as these were becoming more popular, and people were starting to, and other makers were making some things similar to this, we were all calling them mountain bikes generically, even though we knew at the time that mountain bikes were really, a brand. So we didn't know what to call them, and Bicycling Magazine had a contest to settle it once and for all, apparently. Among their readers, the contest was, come up with, what are we going to call these bikes? And the winning entry was ATB, all-terrain bicycles. Fortunately, we didn't get stuck with that, because it was soon after that the word got out, and the industry, found out that, that fell through. It's not trademarked. It's not protected by law. We can all call these mountain bikes now. And so they were probably not too thrilled with that at Mountain Bikes, the company. Gary and Tom and Charlie were probably not thrilled that they lost the legal protection for that name, but ultimately it was good for them, as it was good for the entire mountain bike community and for the industry itself, because you don't want to call these ATBs, do you? No, mountain bikes is much better. And so these were not not cheap. They were quite expensive. $1,300 to $1,400 in 1979 is about like $5,800 in today's money in 2024. That's the same kind of money that you'd spend on a high-end road bike, a Chinelli frame and fork with Campagnolo components throughout, high-end road, Tour de France level road racing bikes. So they weren't getting rich fast, because they were very expensive, and you couldn't find them in bike shops. They were a direct order through the back of usually Bicycling magazine.
Yeah. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you get a chance, if you're in Fairfax, stop by the Bicycle Museum, ask for Kilpatrick if he's in. A wealth of information. We've just barely scratched the surface. There are so many bikes in here, you guys, but definitely wanted to have the history on how mountain biking became mountain biking, how the name became. Kilpatrick, thank you so much for taking me on the tour.
You're welcome, Mark.
I really appreciate it. Again, the name of this place is
the Marin Museum of Bicycling. Also, home of the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame.